Hey again, Art of Theater folks. This lecture will be on Indigenous Theatre, aka Native American Theatre. Because I'm from Canada, the term we use is Indigenous, sometimes First Nations, but but yeah, I know the terminology culturally is just slightly different, and there are organizations here who do use the term Native American. So yeah, so just to know that some of the slides have Indigenous, some have Native American going on. Um, Lovely. So these slides will tell you that the first, or the roots perhaps of Indigenous theater comes from like ceremony, a tradition, uh, which often included some kind of music and dance. And then, well, dance being a big sort of motivation for what eventually became theater. So some of the first slides just look at some of the traditional dances, some of the costumes that came out of that. Often these dances would tell stories representing different animals. There's, rain dances calling in different parts of nature. So a lot of nature imagery is a big part of a lot of Indigenous art because there's such a connection to land. And it says that there's a real mix of who engages in this. So even with the dancing, sometimes it's the elders who participate in this style, and other times it's younger members of the tribe, of the community. And yeah, there's a lot of feathers happening. There's the men's traditional dance and then the women's traditional dance. And there's a really cool video clip that shows more kind of contemporary Indigenous folks who have dedicated a lot of their lives to keeping these traditional practices, these traditional dances alive, and the care and meticulous nature of what goes into their costumes. So a lot of them create their own costumes by hand, all of this kind of beautiful beadwork, that in itself is kind of part of the practice for them. So there's something that makes me think of the traditional Asian theater where there's just such kind of care and reverence in like the making of the masks, trying to preserve sort of a rich history that comes from ancestors and is passed down. Yeah, so dance is a big factor for sure. Something to note, I mean, there's just such a rough history both in Canada and the US with our Indigenous peoples. And so here in America, it says that a lot of those traditional ceremonies and dances especially were banned by the government, banned by churches. A lot of them were banned in kind of the early 19th century. And most of these bans weren't lifted until what we see in the slide, which is like 1978. So kind of from late 1800s into, right up until the 70s, a lot of these kind of traditional practices were banned. There was a real push to try to eradicate a lot of Native American and Indigenous culture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But same time in this sort of mid 60s and 70s, similar to Chicano and Asian American theater, is some Indigenous folks came together to form the Native American Theater Ensemble. There's a little clip of this man named Hanai. I'd have to listen again to his name to do him credit. Giogama, I think, or Giagama. And he's one of the more sort of prominent Native American playwrights in the States, and really played a huge part in the development of and support of Native American theater in those early days, and has continued to as well. In the 70s, there was the sort of American Indian Theater Ensemble, and that was sort of the first all Indigenous company in the United States. So yeah, kind of again, 60s and 70s, a lot of folks started to come together to tell their own stories. Wonderful. And then you can sort of watch and learn more about Hanai in one of the videos. There's a great company you'll see called the Spider Woman Theater Group or Theater Company, which is women. So sort of an all-indigenous female theater group named after the Hopi goddess Spider Woman, who was said to have brought the craft of weaving to the Hopi elders of the Hopi people. And this company was formed in 1975. There's a woman named Muriel Miguel who created sort of a performance art piece that was performed in New York City, and it actually included both Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. But a lot of their stories are about empowering women, kind of in a way similar to like Entezaki Shange and the choreo poems. A lot of their work does include song, poem, music, so less linear and less sort of that linear realist vibe. And then Muriel did a lot of work with her two sisters as well. So the three women that you might see in the slide will be Muriel and her sisters, and they dealt with a lot of socio-political issues like the women are facing. So women in violence, women and war, what it is to be a Native American woman living in the United States. So a lot of their art touched on that. So both an Indigenous theater and kind of a feminist theater lens as well. Yeah. Now it's interesting. It talks a little bit about Native American theater today. Some of the playwrights here, there's a woman named Diane Glancy. I know more of the sort of Canadian Indigenous playwrights. We're reading a Canadian Indigenous play. Another great artist is Thompson Highway. There's a woman named Tara Bagan, Yolanda Bonnell. There's a real resurgence in Canada anyway of supporting Indigenous arts and telling those stories. A real push from kind of the government and the country as a whole, because there's reconciliation is a big thing. So you'll see a little write-up about Diane Glancy, who's an American writer. We almost studied her play, The Woman Who Was the Red Deer Dressed for the Deer Dance. It's cool because it's very imagistic and very surreal. But because of that, and because of my own sort of Canadian heritage, I wanted to bring in a more contemporary voice thing that speaks to, I guess, some of the history that happened there. So Drew Hayden Taylor, the playwright of one of the shows that you guys will read, Only Drunks and Children Tell the Truth, that play is, I want to say, the third in a trilogy. The third or second. I can't remember which number it is, but there's 3 plays. He's written others as well. He's a journalist and an author of novels. But the play that we're going to read, one thing that it'll be good to know about is something called the 60s Scoop that happened in Canada, which was essentially the Canadian government thought it was a good idea to essentially take Indigenous children from like broken families, like single mothers, and place them in the foster care system for white Canadians to adopt. This happened to like 20,000 Indigenous youth and children, and so what was, I suppose, thought of as like for their own good and betterment, they were displaced and replaced. And because of this, you have a lot of Indigenous young adults or adults who have sort of grown up without any sense of tradition, their people, Indigenous ways of life, a lot of stories, a lot of language, a lot of art. So much of that has just been lost. And this play kind of touches on that. We have these 2 kind of white parents who live in London, Ontario, Canada, and their daughter that they've, that they adopted when she was a baby, probably, and kind of her struggle to, or yearning to learn more about her roots and her family, while being actually super loving, is sort of at a loss of how to honor that or introduce it to her, or didn't know how to bring her up with any kind of kind of Indigenous tradition. And then, anyway, so you'll read about it. It's a good play. And yes, it's in London, Ontario, in Canada, not in England. So wonderful. A little bit more Canadian content for you on this front. There's a really beautiful original musical called Children of God. It's about sort of pre-60s scoop in Canada was the residential school system, which was sort of a similar thing. In order to kind of create a unified Canada, a lot of children were essentially taken from their homes to go to school, these like live-in schools, often run by like priests and nuns with, I guess, good intentions. Some of them are sure. And it was sort of like a law, basically. Indigenous parents couldn't often kind of fight this decision, or sometimes couldn't necessarily, there was a language barrier, so couldn't necessarily like read the documents to stop it. And it's just about a brother and sister who have been taken to this school where their language is not allowed, and then some of the abuse basically that happens there, but also the resiliency of these kids who are at this school. Yeah, sounds kind of intense. And it is, but it's also beautiful. And I would totally encourage you to watch the trailer just to hear some of the traditional Indigenous music that comes out of this. So it's a real kind of merging of contemporary musical theater sound and then a lot of instrumentation and sounds of, I think I want to say like it's Ojibwe or Oji Cree nations. So it's really quite moving and beautiful. It was like one of the most beautiful theater experiences of my life. They have the audience sing together at the end. So the woman like comes out with her drum and like it's like this tragic thing happens. She's hitting the drum and then everybody in the audience like is asked to sing along and like you like hold hands with strangers and you're singing and it's beautiful. I love theater. Yeah, check that out. Just another title to know. And then there's the final slide of a one-woman show. I don't know that we talked a lot about that, where there's a lot of kind of one-person shows that happen because, well, budgetarily wise, they're super friendly for a lot of independent theaters or people who want to tour their work. It's low cost. And there's this beautiful one-woman show named Bug by Indigenous woman named Yolanda Bennell. A friend of mine, Cole Alvis, directed this piece. And she's done a really beautiful job. She plays multiple characters of just kind of dealing with family dynamics, how things are passed on generation to generation. And a really interesting conversation that we could have too is recently she asked, the show happened in Toronto, and she asked that only people of color review her show. So she didn't really want feedback, thoughts, or critiques coming from like a white settler lens, which is really interesting, and it was very controversial. But something to think about is, has there been enough white Canadian oppression and opinions, about Indigenous people's existence and work and such. So anyway, interesting discussion we should have in person. But yeah, that's sort of a brief overview of Indigenous theater in America and Canada, which again started in sort of mid-60s to 70s. And there were a few kind of heavy hitters that we feature in the PowerPoint. And just a few kind of clips for you to hear people talk about their work or to see trailers of work, just to get a sense of what the vibe is and what some of the themes are. So, thanks guys.